everybody. Welcome back to Hot Dad Reads. Had a very tired dad day yesterday, but we're back today, and we got cool by lighting everywhere now, so it's very exciting. Let me know what you think. Hey, so it's Hot Dad Reads. This is where I basically do your summer homework for you. We're reading through Les Miserables. We've finished part 1. We're starting part 2, which is basically just the Battle of Waterloo, which is a lot of fun. Read for a little bit tonight. See how far we get. Oh, good. I do have a bookmark. And as always, if you want to help support the stream, the most important thing that you can do is just to hit the little follow button in the corner. There's a little heart or something like that. Once we get over 50 followers, we'll be able to take some of Jeff Bezos' money, and that's really all I care about is taking money from that guy. It's ad money, sure, but you know. And if you want to give me your own money, very thoughtful, gets me lights, gets me a cool microphone. Hey, patreon.com/hotdadreads. And several levels in there. And we totally appreciate it. But we are reading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, a new translation by Christine Doniger. Chapter 7, like part 2, book 1. The Emperor asks his guide Lacoste a question. There's a little bit of... There we go. Therefore, is there also a little bit of... There's a little bit of... Yeah, alright. I think it's still appropriate piloting. So on the morning of Waterloo, Napoleon was feeling pleased. He had reason to be. The battle plan he had devised, as we have established, was indeed admirable. Once the battle had started, the very different turn that events had taken, the resistance of Hougoumont, the tenacity of La Haye Sainte, Baudouin killed, Foy put out of action, the unexpected wall against which Soye's brigade had dashed itself, Guilleminot's fatal blunder in having neither shot nor gunpowder pouches, the batteries floundering in the mud, the 15 unescorted guns toppled by Uxbridge into a sunken road, the limited effect of the bombs falling on the English lines, embedding themselves in the rain-sodden ground and only succeeding in producing volcanoes of mud so that grape shot turned into a splattering, the futility of Peary's show of force on Braine-l'Alleud, all that cavalry, 15 squadrons, more or less wiped out, the English right wing ineffectually harassed, the left wing ineffectually breached, Ney's strange misunderstanding in massing instead of deploying in echelon formation, the 4 divisions of the First Corps, ranks 27 deep with fronts of 200 men, thus exposed to artillery fire, the terrifying inroads into these masses made by cannonballs, the attack columns divided, the broadside batteries suddenly revealed on their flank, Bourgeois, Donzelay, and Duret placed in jeopardy, Quiot repulsed, the Herculean graduate of the Polytechnic School, Lieutenant Vieux, wounded while hacking with an axe at the gate of La Haye Sainte under plunging fire from the English barricade across the sharp bend in the Gnop-Brussels road. Marconnet's division, trapped between infantry and cavalry, shot down in the Rye at point-blank range by Best and Pack, and put to the sword by Ponsonby. The Prince of Saxe-Weimar, whose 7-gun battery had been spiked, holding the retaining Frischemont and Smohain despite Comte de Lon, The 105th's colors captured. The 45th's colors captured. That Prussian black hussar arrested by the scouts of a flying column of 300 light cavalry reconnoitering between Wavre and Plancenoit. The disquieting things this prisoner had said. Grouchy's delay. The 1,500 men killed in less than an hour in the orchard of Hougoumont. The 1,800 men mown down in even less time round La Haye Seine. All these incidents, passing before Napoleon like the clouds of battle, had barely troubled his gaze and cast no shadow on the certitude in that imperial face. The first period we had seen in a long time. Jeez. Napoleon was used to looking at war steadily. He never counted the cost and the heartrending detail of its individual numbers. Numbers mattered little to him, provided they gave this total: victory. It did not alarm him that things should not go according to plan in the early stages. Believing as he did that he was master and owner of the outcome, he could wait, assuming that he was beyond question, and he entreated destiny as his equal. He seemed to say to fate, "You would not dare." Half light, half shadow, Napoleon felt protected in acting for the good and tolerated in doing wrong. He had in his favor, or thought he had, a connivance, one might almost say, a complicity of events, equivalent to antiquity's invulnerability. Yet anyone with Beresina, Leipzig, and Fontainebleau behind him might well have been wary of Waterloo. A mysterious scowl is growing visible in the far reaches of the sky. The moment when Wellington fell back, Napoleon felt a thrill. He suddenly saw the Mont Saint-Jean plateau emptying and the English front disappearing. Their army was rallying, but not in view. The Emperor half rose in his stirrups. The gleam of victory flashed in his eyes. Wellington cornered in the forest of Soignies and destroyed. This was the ultimate overthrow of England by France. It was Crécy, Poitiers, Malplaquet, and Ramillies avenged. The man of Marengo was cancelling out Agincourt. Reflecting on this tremendous change of fortune, the Emperor then swept his field glasses one last time over every part of the battlefield. His guard, standing at attention behind him, gazed up at him with a kind of veneration. He was turning things over in his mind. He examined the slopes, noted the inclines, scrutinized the clumps of trees, the patch of rye, the path. He seemed to be counting every bush. He gazed with some intentness at the 2 English barricades blocking the roads, 2 huge ramparts of felled trees. On one, the Genappe road above La Haye Seine, armed with 2 cannons. Of the entire English artillery, these alone could see the floor of the battlefield, and one on the Nivelles road, where the Dutch bayonets of Chassey's brigade glinted. He noticed near this barricade the old white-painted chapel of St. Nicholas that stands at the corner of that road that cuts across towards Braine-l'Alleud. He leaned over and spoke in the undertone of his to his guide, Lacoste. The guide gave a negative, probably perfidious, shake of the head. The Emperor straightened up again and pondered. Wellington had withdrawn. It only remained to complete this withdrawal by extirpation. I've never seen that word before. Turning round abruptly, Napoleon dispatched a courier to ride to Paris at full gallop with the news that the battle was won. Napoleon was one of those geniuses from which lightning strikes. He had just found his thunderbolt. He gave the order to Milhaud's cuirassiers to take the Mont Saint-Jean plateau. Chapter 9, The Unexpected. They numbered 3,500. They formed a front over half a mile long. They were giant men on colossal horses. There were 26 squadrons, and they had behind them for support Lefebvre Desnouettes division, the 106 elite gendarmes, the light cavalry of the guard, 1,197 men, and the lancers of the guard, 880 lances. They wore helmets without plumes and cuirasses of wrought steel, with horse pistols in their saddle holsters and the long saber sword. That morning the whole army had admired them when, at 9 o'clock, with trumpets sounding and all the bands playing Varlon à Salut de l'Empire, they had come in a dense column, one of their batteries on one flank, the other at their center, and deploying in two ranks between the Genappe road and Frischemont, had taken up their battle position in their strong second line so astutely drawn up by Napoleon, which, with Kellermann's cuirassiers on its far left and Milhaud's cuirassiers on the far right, had, so to speak, two wings of steel. Aide-de-camp Bernard brought them the Emperor's order. Ney drew his sword and placed himself at their head. The enormous squadron set off. It was a magnificent spectacle. All this cavalry with sabers raised, standards flying, and trumpets sounding, in column by division formation, moving simultaneously as one, with the precision of a bronze battering ram opening a breach, descended the hill of La Belle Alliance, plunged into the fearsome depths where so many had already fallen, disappeared in the smoke, then emerging from that obscurity reappeared on the other side of the vale, still massed in close array, riding at full trot through a hail of grape-shot bursting above them, up the dreadful mud slope of the Mont Saint-Jean plateau. Up they rode, solemn, menacing, imperturbable. In the intervals of musket and artillery fire could be heard that great thundering of hoofs. As there were two divisions, there were two columns, with Wathier's division on the right and Delort's on the left. From a distance they looked like two huge adders of steel streaking towards the crest of the plateau. This thing moved through the battle like something supernatural. Nothing like it had been seen since the heavy cavalry's capture of the great redoubt at Borodino. Murat was not here, but Ney was again present. This mass seemed to have turned into a monster and to have but a single soul. Glimpsed through the occasional rift in a vast fog of smoke, each squadron rippled and bulged like a polyp ring. A jumble of helmets, cries, sabers, a turbulent bounding of horses, rumps amid cannon and fanfare, a terrible, disciplined tumult, the cuirasses on top of this like scales of the Hydra. This seems a chronicle of another age. Something similar to this vision appeared no doubt in the old Orphic epics telling of centaurs, those ancient hybrids, those giant creatures with human faces and equine breasts who scaled Olympus at a gallop, horrible, invulnerable, sublime, gods and beasts. By a bizarre numerical coincidence, 26 battalions were to meet these 26 squadrons. Calm, silent, motionless, behind the crest of the plateau, in the shadow of their concealed battery, in 13 square formations, 2 battalions to a square, arranged in 2 lines, 7 in the first, 6 in the second, with the rifle butts to their shoulders, aiming at what was about to appear, the English infantry lay in wait. They could not see the cuirassiers, and the cuirassiers could not see them. They listened to this rising tide of men. They heard the swelling sound of the 3,000 horse, and the alternate and symmetric beat of their cantering hooves, the rattle of their cuirasses. the clinking of the sabers, and a kind of mighty, fierce breathing. There was a terrible silence. Then suddenly, a long row of raised arms brandishing sabers appeared over the ridge, and helmets, and trumpets, and standards, and 3,000 gray mustachioed heads shouting, "Long live the Emperor!" All this cavalry surged onto the plateau, and it was like the arrival of an earthquake. All at once tragedy struck. On the English left, our right, the head of the column of cuirassiers reared up with a frightful clamor. Just when they reached the top of the ridge, riding furiously, totally bent on destruction in their headlong charge on the squares and the cannon, the cuirassiers had noticed a trench, a death trap, lying between them and the English. It was the sunken road to Ohain. This was a moment of horror. There, directly under the horses' hooves, 12 feet deep between the double embankment, yawned the unexpected ravine. The second line drove the first into it, and the third drove the second. The horses reared, then lunged backwards, landed on their rumps, slid with all 4 legs in the air, unseating and flattening their riders. Unable to reverse, the whole column solely a projectile, the impetus gathered to trample the English, now trampling the French. The inexorable ravine could only capitulate when filled. Riders and horses rolled pell-mell into the pit, crushing each other, together forming but one flesh. And when this trench was filled with living men, they were trodden underfoot, and the rest were able to pass. Almost a third of Dubois' brigade fell into that abyss. This is when the battle started to be lost. One local tradition, obviously exaggerating, says 2,000 horses and 1,500 men were entombed in the Ohain sunken road. This figure probably includes all the other dead bodies thrown into this pit the day after the battle. Let us note in passing that it was this Dubois brigade, now meeting with such disaster, that in another charge an hour earlier had captured the standard of the Lüneburg battalion. Before ordering this charge by Milhaud's cuirassiers, Napoleon had scanned the terrain but had not been able to see the sunken road, which did not show up even as a line on the surface of the plateau. Alerted nevertheless and made wary by the little white chapel that stands on the corner where it meets the Nivelles road, he had probably asked the guide Lacoste where there might be some obstacle. The guide had answered no. It might almost be said that shake of a peasant's head was Napoleon's undoing. Yet other disasters were destined to occur. Was it possible Napoleon might have won that battle? We say no. Why? Because of Wellington? Because of Blücher? No. Because of God. Bonaparte, victorious at Waterloo, was no longer in the rubric of the 19th century. Another chapter of history was now in the making, in which Napoleon no longer had any place. Events had long ago indicated their lack of goodwill. It was time for this immense man to fall. The inordinate weight of this man was disturbing the balance of human destiny. This individual alone counted for more than the rest of the world put together. These excessive quantities of human vitality concentrated in a single person, the world going to one man's head, would be fatal to civilization if it were to continue. The moment had come for the incorruptible supremacy of natural justice to intervene. The principles and elements on which depend the normal gravitations within both the moral order and that of the physical world were probably protesting. The stench of spilled blood, cemeteries filled to overflowing, weeping mothers, these make an answerable case. When the earth is gutted, mysterious groanings that emerge from the shadows are heard in the unfathomable abyss. Napoleon had been denounced in the realms of the infinite, and his downfall had been decided. He was an inconvenience to God. Waterloo is no battle. It is a change of front in the universe. Horrifying. Ugh. Take a short reading rest. Trying to think of some fun dad stories. I did stuff over the weekend. What did I do over the weekend? I mean, like, not only, post-pandemic, living in a post-Trump kind of existence, but just being a dad, man, time is hard. It's just hard. Oh, pardon me. I'm sleepy. But yeah, she's a very good baby. It's really fun when I get to make steak. So we just give the child a slab of steak, and she's so happy. It's just like, for me, really? She's got 4 teeth now. She just tears into that thing. She mostly just kind of bites it and gets the juices out of it, really, but it's really fun. Went on a nice walk today. Took the baby to a park nearby. Went down a slide. A lot of fun. Excited to go find one of those baby swing sets. She's been on one before. Put her on that. It's a lot of fun. She smiles. Laundry will never actually be done, but that's just, such is life. My dad came to visit. That's what happened. Yeah. It's always nice when the grandparents get to see the baby. Because she always takes a minute to be like, I know you. And then she's fine, but just in that minute. So it's fun between my dad and my mom, who are a little more, shall we say, gentle, slightly standoffish, slightly oh, we'll give her time to figure it out. Versus my wife's mom, who's just no, we're best friends, let's go. And it works. Her confidence makes Marin be oh yeah, no, we're doing this, yeah. It's really cute. But man, I am tired. It's not even my bones anymore. It's just the constant weight of vigilance. Just, wow. I feel like even if I was in my 20s, I'd still be this tired. It's a lot. But anyway, let's read some more. Chapter 10, the Mont Saint-Jean Plateau. The battery revealed itself at the same time as the ravine. 60 cannons and the 13 squares fired at the cuirassiers at close range. The intrepid General Delort gave the English battery the military salute. All the English flying artillery had galloped back inside the squares. The cuirassiers did not even pause. The sunken road disaster had taken its toll, but had not daunted them. They were men whose courage increases as their numbers diminish. Wathier's column alone had suffered in the disaster. Delort's column, which Ney had ordered to veer to the left, as though sensing the pitfall, arrived intact. The cuirassiers hurled themselves on the English square, riding flat out, no reining back, sabers clamped between teeth, pistols in hand. Such was the attack. There are moments in battle when the soul so hardens the man, the soldier changes into a statue, when all this flesh turns to granite. The English battalions under furious assault stood fast, so what followed was terrifying. The English squares were attacked on all sides simultaneously. A frenzied whirl enveloped them. The infantry remained coldly impassive. The first rank, kneeling, met the cuirassiers and their bayonets. The second rank fired on them. Behind the second rank, the gunners charged their cannons. The front of the square opened up, allowing a blast of grape shot through, then closed again. The cuirassiers replied by pressing on. Their huge horses reared, took the ranks in their stride, leapt over the bayonets and came down, gigantic as they were, in the middle of these four living walls. The cannonballs ripped through the cuirassiers made breaches in the squares. Rows of men disappeared, crushed under the horses. Bayonets were plunged into the bellies of these centaurs, hence the hideous sounds of a kind perhaps not seen elsewhere. This frenzied cavalry having taken its toll on them, the squares closed up with no failure of nerve. With inexhaustible supplies of grape shot, they created explosions in their assailants' midst. The face of this battle was monstrous. These squares were no longer battalions, they were craters. These cuirassiers were no longer cavalry, they were a storm. Each square was a volcano attacked by a cloud. Lava strove against thunderbolts. From the very first of these onslaughts, the square on the extreme right, the most exposed of all, being out on a limb, was almost annihilated. It was formed of the 75th Regiment of Highlanders. As the killing went on around them, the bagpiper in the middle, with his eyes downcast in profound heedlessness, his melancholy gaze filled with the reflection of forests and lakes, sat on a drum with the bag under his arm, playing the Highland airs. These Scotsmen died thinking of Ben Lothian, as the Greeks died remembering Argos. The sword of a cuirassier, lopping off the bag and the arm that held it, put an end to the song by killing the singer. Relatively few in number, and reduced by the trench catastrophe, the cuirassiers were up against almost the entire English army here, but they excelled themselves, each man the equal of 10. Meanwhile, some Hanoverian battalions gave ground. Wellington saw this, and his thoughts turned to his cavalry. Had Napoleon's thoughts at that same moment turned to his infantry, he would have won the battle. This oversight was his great fatal mistake. All of a sudden the cuirassiers, who had been the assailants, found themselves assailed. The English cavalry was at their back. Before them, the squares. Behind them, Somerset. That is to say, 1,400 dragoon guards. Somerset had Dornberg with the German light horse on his right, and on his left Trippe with the Belgian carabineers. Attacked on their flank and head-on, before and behind, by infantry and cavalry, the cuirassiers had to defend themselves on all sides. What did they care? They were a whirlwind. Their valor was beyond words. Furthermore, they had the battery still thundering away behind them. It must have been so for these men to have been wounded in the back. One of their cuirasses, holed by a Biscayan ball in the left shoulder plate, is in the collection of the so-called Waterloo Museum. For such Frenchmen, no less than such Englishmen, were required. It was no longer a fray. It was a darkness, a fury, a vertiginous rage of souls and spirits, a hurricane of flashing swords. In an instant, the 1,400 dragoon guards were no more than 800. Further, their lieutenant colonel was killed. Ney, brought up Lefebvre, Desnos lancers, and light horse. The Mont Saint Jean plateau was captured, recaptured, captured again. The cuirassiers relinquished the cavalry and returned to the infantry, or rather, that whole tremendous throng was engaged in close combat, none letting go of the other. The squares still held firm. There were 12 assaults. Ney had 4 horses killed under him. Half the cuirassiers remained on the plateau. This fighting went on for 2 hours. The English army was deeply shaken by it. There was no doubt that they had not been weakened in their first assault by the disaster at the sunken road. The cuirassiers would have overwhelmed the center and decided the victory. This extraordinary cavalry struck terror in Clinton, who had lived through Talavera and Badajoz. 3/4 vanished. Wellington expressed a hero's admiration. "Splendid," he said under his breath. The cuirassiers, in the French subtext, sublime, which Hugo footnotes splendid, mot textuel, meaning the word he actually said. Oh my God. Wellington said, "Sublime!" That guy's a Ken. The cuirassiers destroyed 7 of the 13 squares, seized or spiked 60 guns, and captured from the English regiment 6 flags, with 3 cuirassiers and 3 light cavalry of the guard, brought to the Emperor in front of the farm at La Belle Alliance. I wonder if that's what 6 flags is about. Wellington's situation had worsened. This strange battle was like a ferocious duel between 2 wounded men who, while still fighting and holding out against each other, are both bleeding to death. Which of the 2 will be the first to fall? The struggle for the plateau continued. How far did the cuirassiers get? No one could rightly say. What is certain is that, on the day after the battle, a cuirassier and his horse were found dead in a weighbridge structure at Mont Saint Jean, at the very point where the 4 roads from Nivelles, Genappe, La Hulpe, and Brussels meet and intersect. This horseman had passed right through the English lines. One of the men who found the bodies still lives at Mont Saint Jean. His name is Dehaze. He was 18 years old at the time. Wellington felt the scales tipping against him. The crisis was approaching. The cuirassiers had not succeeded, in the sense that there had been no breakthrough in the center. With everyone holding the plateau, no one held it, and in short, it remained for the most part with the English. Wellington had the village and the flat ground above. Ney had only the ridge and the slope. On both sides they seemed rooted in that lugubrious soil. But the English were sinking. Beyond recovery, it seemed. The hemorrhaging of his army was horrible. Kempt on the left wing demanded reinforcements. "There are none," replied Wellington. "Let him fight to the death." By a singular coincidence which reflects the exhaustion of both armies, almost at that same moment Ney asked Napoleon for additional infantry, and Napoleon exclaimed, "Infantry? Where does he expect me to find any? Does he expect me to create infantry?" Nevertheless, the English army was the more stricken of the 2. The furious charges of those great squadrons, with their metal cuirasses and steely breasts, had pounded the infantry. A few men around a flag marked where a regiment had been posted. Many a battalion was now commanded by a mere captain or lieutenant. Alten's division, which had already suffered so badly at La Haye Sainte, was almost destroyed. The intrepid Belgians of Van Klootz's brigade lay strewn on the rye fields along the Nivelles road. Almost nothing was left of those Dutch grenadiers who, in 1811, fought alongside us in Spain against Wellington, and in 1815 joined the English side to fight against Napoleon. The number of officers lost was considerable. Lord Uxbridge, who buried his leg the following day, had a shattered knee. while on the French side, in that assault by the cuirassiers, Delort, L'Heritier, Colbert, Donop, Travers, and Blancard were put out of action. On the English side, Alton was wounded, Barnes was wounded, Delancey was wounded, Van Merlin killed, Umteda killed, the whole of Wellington's general staff decimated, and England had the worst of it in that bloody deadlock. The 2nd Regiment of Foot Guards had lost 5 lieutenant colonels, 4 captains, and 3 ensigns. The 1st Battalion of the 30th Infantry had lost 24 officers and 112 soldiers. The 79th Highlanders had lost 24 officers wounded, 18 officers dead, 450 soldiers killed. The entire regiment of the Hanoverian Cumberland Hussars, commanded by Colonel Hake, who was later to be court-martialed and cashiered, had turned tail at the sight of the fighting and fled into the forest of Soignies, sowing panic all the way to Brussels. Transport vehicles, munitions trucks, baggage wagons, carts full of wounded casualties, seeing the French gaining ground and approaching the forest, made a dash for it. The Dutch, who had been attacked by the French cavalry, fueled the alarm. From Vertcoco to Groenendael, over a distance of nearly 5 miles in the direction of Brussels, according to the testimony of eyewitnesses still alive today, the roads were choked with those fleeing. This panic was such that it spread to the Prince de Conde à Mechlin and to Louis XVIII at Ghent. Apart from the weak reserve force positioned behind the field hospital set up at Mont-Saint-Jean Farm and Vivian and Vandeleurs brigades that flanked the left wing, Wellington had no more cavalry. A number of batteries lay dismounted. These facts are acknowledged by Siborne, and Pringle, exaggerating the disaster, goes so far as to say that the Anglo-Dutch army was reduced to 34,000 men. The Iron Duke remained calm, but his lips had paled. The Austrian Commissioner Vincent and the Spanish Commissioner Alava, present at the battle on the English general staff, thought the Duke was defeated. At 5 o'clock, Wellington drew out his watch and was heard to murmur these grim words, "Night or Blücher?" It was at about that moment that a distant line of bayonets glinted on the high ground above Frischemont. That was the turning point in this huge drama. I grab a quick drink. It's a weird thing, the word decimated, because we come to understand decimated as being completely, totally, utterly destroyed. But decimated comes from, like, deca, deci, meaning 10. The whole point of Roman decimation was that, when it would happen, basically, the instance that I know of was like, okay, here's a Roman legion that failed. They ran away. They lost a battle. They did not live up to Roman standards. So the legion would be decimated. And by that, they would line up, and basically every 10th man was killed. So if you had 1,000 people, you lost 100 people, now you have 900 people. And it was just, the shame of it all, the fear of it all, and obviously just the severe morale, loss of morale of having to kill your own soldiers. Count to 10, and this guy has to stab the guy next to him, kind of a thing. I don't know precisely, but it's horrifying. It's something in the Hardcore History podcast Dan Carlin will always talk about, but they have these moments when an entire army is captured and destroyed and killed, and talk about these moments in history when the horrifying efficiency of an army killing another army, of just What's it like when, thousands of people are all just lined up and murdered in like an hour? Less than. When every soldier has like 100 people in front of him, you just cut off a head, cut off a head, cut off a head. Like, whoa, what is that? What are humans capable of? So when you have to do it to your own people, when you have to destroy a tenth of your army, of your legion, shall we say. But since time, that's moved on to, decimated means completely destroyed. And really decimated is, I lost a finger. I was decimated. Words are neat. Moving on. Chapter 11. A bad guy for Napoleon, a good guide for Bülow. Napoleon's bitter disappointment is common knowledge. The hoped-for Grouchy turning out to be Blücher, death instead of life. Fate takes these turns. You are expecting to rule the world. St. Helena comes into view. If the shepherd boy who served as guide to Blücher's second-in-command, Bülow, had advised him to exit the forest above Frischemont instead of below Placenois, the shape of the 19th century might have been different. Napoleon would have won the Battle of Waterloo. By any other route than the one below Plancenoit, the Prussian army would have come to a gully their artillery could not have negotiated, and Bülow would not have arrived. Now we have it from the Prussian general Muffling that an hour's delay and Blücher would have found Wellington no longer holding his own. The battle was lost. Clearly, Bülow arrived just in time. He had, after all, been greatly delayed. He had bivouacked at Dion-le-Mont and set out at first light, but the roads were impassable and his divisions had become mired. The ruts came up to the cannons' wheel hubs. Furthermore, he had to cross the Dyle over the narrow bridge at Wavre. The street leading to the bridge had been set on fire by the French, so the ammunition supplies and artillery vehicles, unable to pass between two rows of burning houses, had to wait until the fire was extinguished. It was midday before Bülow's vanguard even reached Chapelle Saint-Lambert. Had the action begun 2 hours earlier, it would have been over by 4 o'clock, and Blücher would have turned up to the battle won by Napoleon. Such are these immense quirks of fate, commensurate with an infinite we cannot comprehend. As early as midday, the Emperor, with his telescope, had been the first to notice on the far horizon something that arrested his attention. He said, "I see a cloud over there that looks like troops to me." Then he asked the Duc de Dalmatie, "Soult, what do you see over towards Chapelle Saint-Lambert?" Training his field glass, the Marshal answered, 4,000 or 5,000 men, sire. Obviously Grouchy. Yet whatever it was remained motionless in the haze. All the general's staff field glasses studied the cloud, pointed out by the Emperor. Some said, "They're columns resting." Most said, "They're trees." The truth is, the cloud did not move. The Emperor sent Domon's division of light cavalry as a reconnaissance detachment to investigate. Pardon me. Indeed, Bülow had not moved. His vanguard was very weak and could do nothing. He was having to wait for the main body of the army, and he had been ordered to assemble his forces before entering the fray. But at 5 o'clock, seeing Wellington imperiled, with these remarkable words, Blücher ordered Bülow to attack. "We must give the English army some air." Shortly afterwards, the divisions of Losthin, Hiller, Hake, and Reissel deployed in front of Lobau's corps. Prince William of Prussia's cavalry emerged from the Bois de Paris. Plancenoit was in flames, and Prussian cannonballs began to rain even on the ranks of the reserve guard behind Napoleon. Chapter 12. The Guard. we know the rest. The intervention of a third army, the battle reconfigured, the thundering of 86 guns firing simultaneously. Perch the first turning up among Bulow, Zayton's army led by Blücher himself, the French driven back. Marcognet swept from the Ohain Plateau, Duret dislodged from Papelotte, Donzelot and Quiot falling back, Lobau caught obliquely. A fresh battle unleashed on our shattered regiments as dusk fell, the whole English line resuming the offensive and pressing forward. The gigantic breach opened up in the French army, English grape shot and Prussian grape shot assisting each other. The slaughter, disaster on the front line, disaster on the flanks, the Guard entering the fray amid this dreadful destruction. Sensing they were about to die, they shouted, "Long live the Emperor!" There is nothing more stirring in history than the roar of these acclamations in the throes of death. The sky had been overcast all day. Suddenly, at that very moment, it was 8 o'clock in the evening. The clouds on the horizon parted, letting the great sinister glow of the setting sun filter through the elms on the Nivelles road. At Austerlitz, they had seen the sunrise. For this final act, every battalion of the Guard was commanded by a general. Friant, Michel, Roguet, Harlot, Malot, Paré de Morvan there were. When, through the fog of this battle, the Grenadier Guards' tall hats with their large eagle plates appeared, identical, aligned, steady, splendid, the enemy felt a respect for France. It was like seeing 20 victories entering on the field of battle with their wings spread, and those who were the victors, believing themselves to be vanquished, fell back. But Wellington shouted, "Up, Guards, and at 'em!" The Red Regiment of English Guards lying behind the hedges sprang up. A hail of grape shot riddled the tricolour flag fluttering round our eagles. All charged at each other, and the final carnage began. The Imperial Guard sensed in the dusk the army falling back around it, and the immense panic of a rout. It heard the desperate "Every man for himself" that had replaced "Long live the Emperor," and while those behind fled, they continued to advance, with more and more of them stricken and dying with every step they took. There were no falterers, no faint hearts. The soldier in that troop was as much a hero as the general. Not a man among them shirked that suicide. Frenzied with all the noble grandeur of death accepted, Ney put himself in the way of every onslaught in that bloodbath. That is where he had his 5th horse killed under him. Sweating, with fire in his eyes, foam on his lips, his uniform unbuttoned, one of his epaulets cut in half by a saber stroke from a horse guard, his great eagle plate dented by a bullet, bleeding, muddied, magnificent, a broken sword in his hand, he said, "Come and see how a Marshal of France dies on the battlefield." But to no avail. He did not die. He was distraught and incensed. To Drouot d'Erlon he threw himself down this challenge. "Are you not going to get yourself killed?" In the midst of all that artillery fire that was destroying a handful of men, he cried, "Is there nothing, then, for me? Oh, I wish all these English shells would strike me in the belly." Ill-fated man, you were saved for French bullets. Chapter 13, The Catastrophe. The rout behind the Guard was grim. The army suddenly collapsed on all sides at once. At Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, Papelotte, Plancenoit. The cry of treachery was followed by the cry of "Every man for himself." An army on the run is a thaw setting in. Everything gives way, splits, cracks, wobbles, overturns, falls, jostles, hurries, hurtles on. Extraordinary disintegration. Ney borrows a horse, leaps on it, and without a cravat, hatless and swordless, stands astride the Brussels road, stopping both English and French. He tries to detain the army. He calls it back. He insults it. He grasps at the absconders. He is overwhelmed. The soldiers flee from him, shouting, "Long live Marshal Ney!" Two of Duret's regiment go back and forth, bewildered, as though tossed between the Uhlans, sabres, and the fusillades of Kempt, Best, Pack, and Rylance brigades. The worst of frays is a rout. Friends kill each other so as to make their escape. Squadrons and battalions dash against each other and disperse. A vast battle spume. Lobau at one end and Ray at the other are caught up in the surge. In vain does Napoleon form defense lines with what he has left of the guard. In vain does he expend in a final effort the squadrons serving as his personal escort. Guyot retreats before Vivian, Kellerman before Vandeleur, Lebeau before Bülow, Morand before Perche, Doman and Subervie before Prince William of Prussia. Guyot, who led the Emperor's squadrons in their charge, falls under the feet of the English dragoons. Napoleon gallops along the lines of fugitives, harangues, urges, threatens, entreats them. All those mouths that had shouted that morning, "Long live the Emperor," remain agape. They hardly recognize him. The Prussian cavalry, newly arrived, comes in hot pursuit, swoops, sabers, slashes, hacks, kills, exterminates. The draft animals bolt. The cannons flee. The soldiers of the artillery train unhitch the ammunition wagons and use the horses to escape. Overturned wagons and their heels in the air block the road and cause havoc. Men crush and trample one another, walk over the living and the dead. Arms flail. A dizzying multitude fills the roads, paths, bridges, plains, hills, valleys, woods, choked by this invasion of 40,000 men. Cries, desperation, knapsacks and guns tossed into the rye, swords used to slash a way through. No comrades now, no officers, no generals. Indescribable terror. Zieten cutting France down at his leisure. The lions turned into hunted deer. Such was this flight. At Genappe there was an attempt to turn and make a stand, to check the rout. Lobau rallied 300 men. It's Lobo. Yeah. The entrance to the village was barricaded, but at the first volley of Prussian artillery fire, all fled again, and Lobau was taken. That volley of fire can be seen today imprinted on the gable of an old brick farm building on the right-hand side of the road a few minutes before the entrance to Genappe. The Prussians fell in Genappe, no doubt infuriated at having so little proved themselves victors. Their pursuit was monstrous. Blücher gave the orders for slaughter. Roguet had set a macabre example by threatening with death any French grenadier who brought him a Prussian prisoner. Blücher outdid Roguet. Cornered in the doorway of an inn at Genappe, the general of the Young Guard, Duhamel, surrendered his sword to a death's head hussar, who took the sword and slew his prisoner. Victory ended with the assassination of the vanquished. Let us punish, since history is ours. Old Blücher sought dishonor on himself. This ferocity was the culmination of the disaster. The desperate rout continued through Genappe, Quatre-Bras, Gozelets, Frasne, Charleroi, and only stopped at the frontier. Alas, And who was it that fled in this way? The Grand Army. This madness, this terror, this collapse into ruin of the greatest bravery that has ever amazed history, was this without cause? No. The shadow of an enormous right hand falls on Waterloo. It was the day of destiny. The power that exceeds man shaped that day. Hence the terrified furrow on those brows. Hence all those noble souls surrendering their swords. Those who had conquered Europe were completely cast down, having nothing more to say or do, sensing a terrible presence in that shadow. Hoc erat infatis. This was fated. An allusion to lines 481 through 42 in Ovid's Fasti. Sic erat infatis, nec te tua culpa fugavit, sed Deus offenso pulsus es erbo Deo. It was fated so. It was no fault of yours that exiled you, but God. You are expelled from the city by an offended God. On that day, the prospects of the human race changed. Waterloo is the pivot on the 19th century. The demise of the great man was essential to the advent of the great century. Someone who is not to be challenged took care of it. The hero's panic is understandable. The Battle of Waterloo was not just a matter of cloud, it was a matter of meteorology. Meteorology, it's a hard word. God intervened. At nightfall, in a meadow near Genappe, Bernard and Bertrand stopped a man, grabbing hold of him by the skirt of his coat. Distraught, bemused, this desperado caught up in the rout and carried along this far had just dismounted, tucked the reins of his horse under his arm, and, wild-eyed, was making his way back, alone, to Waterloo. It was Napoleon, still trying to keep going, immense somnambulist of this shattered dream. Chapter 14, The Last Square. Several squares of the guard, steadfast in this tide of disorderly retreat, like rocks of flowing water, held out until nightfall. With darkness descending, and death too, resolute, they awaited that twofold obscurity that allowed it to close in on them. Isolated from the others and cut off from the army, now scattered in every direction, each regiment died alone. To make this final stand, they had taken up position, some on the Rossomme heights, others on the Mont Saint-Jean plain. There, abandoned, vanquished, awesome, these grim squares died magnificently. Ulm, Wagram, Jena, Friedland died with them. At twilight, around 9 o'clock in the evening, below the Mont Saint-Jean plateau, there was one left in that fateful valley, at the foot of the slope the cuirassiers had climbed and that was now thronged with the massed English. Under the converging fire of the victorious enemy's artillery, under an appalling density of missiles, this square fought on. It was commanded by an unknown officer named Cambronne. At each discharge, the square diminished and countered. It replied to grape shot with gunfire, its four walls continually contracting. Far away, fugitives pausing breathless for a moment, listened in the shadows to that dismal, diminishing thunder. When this legion was no more than a handful, when their flag was no more than a tatter, when, having used up all their bullets, their guns were no more than truncheons, when the heap of corpses was larger than the group left alive, there was among the victors a sort of sacred terror around these noblest of dying men, and the English artillery, pausing for breath, fell silent. It was a respite of sorts. These combatants had what seemed like specters milling about them, silhouettes of men on horseback, the dark profiles of cannons, the white sky glimpsed through wheels and gun carriages. The colossal death's head that heroes always glimpse through the smoke in the thick of battle advanced on them and watched. Through the shades of dusk, they could hear the artillery guns being loaded. The lighted linstocks formed a circle around them, like tigers' eyes in the dark. All the gunners of the English batteries approached their cannons, and then, holding the moment of death suspended above these men, an English general, Colville according to some, Maitland according to others, his emotions stirred, shouted to them, "Brave Frenchmen, surrender!" Cambronne replied, "Merde." Hot damn. I don't know why so much of Les Miserables right now is just the Battle of Waterloo, but hey, so it is. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm going to call it for now. Please remember patreon.com/hotdadreads if you want to give us money directly. But if you don't want to use money but still support the stream, please, whatever corner it's in, at twitch.tv/hotdadreads, hit the follow button, the heart button, whatever it is button. It's completely free. You just got to subscribe. You don't have to watch these things live. You don't even have to be notified. As long as we get more followers, then we can monetize the stream and take money from Jeff Bezos. So please help me out to do that. And hey, if you want to give us money and get access to things like the super secret Saturday Shakespeare stream, or access to all the books that we've already read on the stream, these include things like Much Ado About Nothing, Julius Caesar, Pride and Prejudice, War of the Worlds. Patreon.com/hotdadreads. I'm so tired. I'm gonna drink a Coke and go to bed. Yeah, the caffeine has no effect on me now. It's just... And hey, I don't really check the social media, but if not in the comments on youtube.com/@hotdadreads, or in the comments of the Twitch chat, or on Instagram @HotDadReads. Let me know what you think. I got more lights today, so let me know if you like it. There's different colors than just the typical bi-lighting we can use. But hey, thank you so much for tuning in. Have yourselves an agreeable evening.